Someone came knocking at my wee small door. Someone came knocking, I'm sure, sure, sure. I opened, I listened, I looked from left to right, but nothing was a-stirring in the still, dark night. Only the busy beetle tap-tapping on the wall. Only in the forest the hoot owl's call. So I know not who came knocking, at all, at all, at all. Poems and stories for Halloween.
Hi, my name's Alex, and I'm going to tell the story of the scratching. Once there was two parents, and they were going out, and so they hired their favorite babysitter and for their kids. And so they went out, and right after they left, the babysitter heard at the door. And so she opened up the door, and nobody was there. So she closed the door and started to play a game with the kids. And a couple minutes later, she heard the same noise at the door. So she opened up the door, and nobody was there again. So she put the kids to bed, because it was their bedtime, and after the kids were all tucked in, she heard at the door again. So she opened up the door, and by this time she was getting a little nervous. So she called the police. The police came and searched the whole house, around the house. They didn't find anything. So then she remembered to check on the children, and the children were all cut up in little pieces.
My name's Kim Frumpkin, and I'm telling the story of Aren't You Glad You Didn't Turn On the Lights? There are two roommates, and they lived in a dorm, and one of them needs to study for a test, and the other one wanted to go to bed. So the one who needs to study for the test went downstairs in the library, and the other one went to bed. And after a while, the one who was studying for the test got thirsty. So she went up to get a drink, and she's going to turn on the lights, but she decided, nah, I'll just wake my roommate. So she went in and got a Coke, and the next day after the test, she came back, and all around her dorm there were police. And she asked what was the matter. And they said this girl had been murdered. And they showed her a picture, and it was her roommate. So she went in, and on the mirror, written in blood, it said, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?"
I'm Kara, and I'm going to tell a story called the Graveyard Game. Once there was a girl named Barbara Flores. She and her friends were having a sneak in the graveyard. One day she was it. She doesn't like being it because she doesn't like running that much, but her friends were outside the graveyard while she was counting. And she went outside the graveyard to go to get them, and they all ran. So she went back and sat next to a grave. Then she saw her friend Ed again, and since she didn't like graveyards, she went out to go get them. She went and saw them, so she was going to get up, and then she decided not to because they were just going to run. So they started to run, and she just stayed there, and then all of a sudden something grabbed her. She tried to get away, but she couldn't. The next day, her friends went to her house, and she wasn't there. So then they went to the graveyard, and she wasn't there sitting next to the grave. So she went and they looked at the grave. They went and looked at the grave, and it said her name, Barbara Flores.
One autumn morning, the leaves were orangish red, and the pumpkins too. There was something in the tree. It was a chattering, tricky squirrel.
The leaves start to fall. The nights get a lot cooler. Children pick apples. Pumpkins are sold at a farm. The trees begin to look bare.
On Halloween night, I saw a spooky white ghost. I saw a witch too. I saw a jack-o'-lantern, and I saw a big black cat.
Creepy, crawly night, so spooky, so scary. On Halloween night, the full moon shines in the sky. The jack-o'-lanterns light up.
Spooky goblins. I
under the full moon terror, in the graveyard ghosts, scary goblins chasing me. Oh no, there they are.
On a deep, dark night, the goblins are chasing me. They take my body. I wake up in a cold sweat. Then I go trick-or-treating.
Hayrides are fun, but oh so spooky too. Oh no, a goblin came to haunt my soul and scrape my skin. I have to run or I'll die.
Here are some stories that come from the Ozark Mountains. The Ozark Mountains are down in Arkansas and Missouri. And this first story is called Jack and the Sally Bally. Now you know Jack, how he did that thing with the beanstalk and killed the giant. Well, after he did that, he thought he ought to go visit his grandparents, his grandma and grandpa. They lived in the Ozark Mountains, and they had themselves a big apple orchard. And every fall, they'd pick them apples and they'd put them in a big iron pot and boil them, and the smell of them apples would fill the valley. And it woke up an ornery critter called the Sally Bally. And the Sally Bally come to the orchard, and he picked up that pot of hot boiling apples and he drunk it down just like his cold cider. And Grandma and Grandpa, they hid for 2 days. Well, then Jack, he comes for his visit, and Grandpa says to Jack, how about we go pick us some more apples? So they went back to the orchard. And Jack and Grandpa, they each had a bucket, and they's a picking apples, and Grandpa says, Jack, you know what I'm going to do? And Jack, he says, what? And Grandpa says, I'm going to make a big old trap and catch that Sally Bally. And Jack, he said, well, I'll help you. So they started planning how they's going to dig the trap. You know how men folks are. And the scent of them apples that they was picking got into the lair of the Sally Bally and woke him up. Now, I suppose I better tell you what this old Sally Bally looked like. He's about 20 feet tall, and 18 feet of that was his legs. And he had big ears the size of wagons, and his arms hung down pert nigh to the ground, and he had a mouthful of teeth like knives. He was not a purty sight. And he comes towards the orchard, and Grandpa and Jack, they sees him, and they starts a-running. They drops their apples, they drops their buckets, and first the Sally Bally stops and eats up all of Jack's apples. And then he eats up Jack's bucket. And then he eats up all of Grandpa's apples, and he eats up Grandpa's bucket. And Grandpa and Jack, they get back to the house, and they hid under that big iron pot. So when the Sally Bally gets there, there's nobody but Grandma. Grandma, she's a-setting on the porch. She was a-smoking on her corncob pipe, and she's setting there in her rocking chair, and she was weaving at her loom. So she was weaving and rocking, and she just liked sitting there like that. And she sees that big old Sally Bally coming, and he says, where them men folks at? And Grandma, she says, I don't know. Now the Sally Bally knew Grandma was lying. So he stuck his big old ugly head right next to her, and he said, if you don't tell me, I'm gonna smash your porch. Now Grandma, she was right fond of her front porch. She didn't want nobody messing with it, and she looked up, and she saw the Sally Bally's big old ear right in front of her. So she jumped in, and she pulled in her rocking chair, and she pulled in her loom, and she sat down inside his ear, and she started rocking and weaving. And all that ruckus inside the Sally Bally's, it just about drove him nuts. So he started running around screaming, but all that running didn't bother Grandma none, 'cause she was used to going up and down the Ozark Mountains in a wagon. But boy, that rocking and that weaving sure did bother the Sally Bally. He run over to a great big stone cliff, and he started banging his head against the cliff, and he knocked his head against the rock so hard, he killed himself. And he fell down dead. And Jack and Grandpa, they come over and they pull out Grandma from the dead Sally Bally's ear, and they pulled out her rocking chair and her loom, and they took it all back home. And Grandma set herself up again, sat down in her rocking chair, and went back to weaving. And Jack and Grandpa, they said, well, shouldn't we go bury that dead old Sally Bally? And Grandma, she said, no, just leave him be. The moss will grow on him. The ferns will grow on him. The weeds will grow on him. And by springtime, you won't even know that he was there at all. And you know, she was right. Now, that's one thing that they do in the fall in the Ozark Mountains. And this story tells about something else that they do in October. There was an old conjure woman lived up in the mountains, and she had so many spells and herbs and roots. She had only one friend, and that was a mean old razorback hog. And that hog hung around with her, and he ate so many of her magic roots. Folks said that sometimes they saw that hog walking around like a man. That's what folks said. Now, every October in the Ozark Mountains was hog slaughtering time. Everybody would bring all their pigs and hogs to one place, and after they killed them, they'd put the hogs in boiling water and just boiling them and boil them till all the meat fell off the bones. And then everybody'd take the meat home to last them all winter, and they'd salt it and take good care of it. And after they had the meat, there was nothing left but the bloody bones and the raw heads of the hogs. Now, there was one hillbilly, he was right lazy. He didn't want to bother taking care of hogs, so he'd just go around and steal them from other folks. And I guess he stole that old conjure woman's pet, and he took that hog to the slaughtering. And at the end of the day, the hillbilly had himself a sack of meat, and he had the raw head that had come from the hog. So he takes these in his wagon, and he's going back up the mountain, and his wagon hits a rock, and the raw head bumps out of the wagon and lands on the road. And the raw head says, "Bloody bones, come to me." And back in the slaughtering pen, all the bloody bones that had belonged to that raw head comes together, and they gets the raw head, and then they goes into the woods. And that raw head borrows stuff from other critters. It borrows the fangs from the panther, and it borrows the claws from the bear, and it borrows the bushy tail from the raccoon. And then old raw head goes to the lazy hillbilly's house. Now that man and his wife, they's asleep in bed, and they hear some ruckus in their house. So the man gets out of bed and he looks around. He don't see nothing. And then he looks up the chimney, and he sees big old eyes staring at him. And he says, "Great land of Goshen, why you big old eyes staring at me?" And Rawhead says, "To see your grave." He looks up again. He says, "Oh, land of Goshen, why you got them sharp claws?" And Rawhead says, "To dig your grave." And he looks up again. He says, "Great land of Goshen, why you got that bushy tail?" And Rawhead says, "To sweep your grave. And the man hides under the bed and he says, Great land of Goshen, why you got them sharp teeth? And old Rawhead says, to eat you up. And he comes down the chimney and he steals away that old lazy hillbilly, and he steals away a horse. And nobody ever seen that lazy hillbilly again, but they see old Rawhead. They see him walking around, and sometimes he's wearing the shirt and the overalls of that hillbilly, and he's riding around on that stolen horse, and he's holding up his raw head, and you can see it silhouetted against the moon. And on Halloween, down in the Ozark Mountains, that's what folks see. And if you go down there, you would see it too. And now, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. She was a queen. She was a mean queen. She commanded and she demanded. And if you didn't do what she told you to, she cut off your head, and then you were dead. She gained fame, and they gave her the name Bloody Mary. Then she died, and nobody cried for Bloody Mary. People forgot what she was and was not. Bloody Mary. Centuries passed, and then at last kids told the story about the queen who was gory, Bloody Mary. The kids said, just like before, if you called out her name, you would see her once more. If you stood in your room in the middle of the night and looked at the mirror and turned out the light and said the words that were exactly right, you'd see her in your mirror, and she'd give you such a fright, Bloody Mary. There was a little girl who loved scary stories. She and her friends would tell them and squeal. She never thought that the things in the stories might be real. She heard of Bloody Mary, and she learned the words to chant. She stood in front of her mirror, and she said, oh, I can't. But it's such fun to be scared. She said, oh, it can't hurt, she thought, and she quite forgot all she'd been taught by her mom and her preacher and her grade school teacher. I do believe in Bloody Mary, she whispered, and she stood in front of the mirror. I do believe in Bloody Mary, she repeated. She leaned nearer and nearer. I do believe in Bloody Mary, she said in the darkness and gloom. I do believe in Bloody Mary, she said all alone in her room. Then she looked at herself, and her hair was a mess, and where she got these clothes she just couldn't guess. And she looked at herself, and her skin was cruddy, and she held up her hands, and her hands were bloody. Those eyes weren't her eyes. They were gruesome and scary. The face in her mirror was Bloody Mary. The little girl screamed and let out a yelp. She tried to step back, tried to call for help. The awful queen leaped out of the mirror. The girl tried to yell, but no one could hear her. Bloody Mary reached for the little girl's throat with her bloody hands and her velvet coat. The little girl screamed and turned on the light and stood all alone by herself in the night. Bloody Mary.
When
Once there was a boy named Sam and his parents. One day, Sam's parents went to Mexico for their vacation. And Sam's mother said,
"We'll bring you something nice."
and Sam said, "What is it?"
"It's a surprise."
So then they went to Mexico. When they went to Mexico, they found a beautiful sombrero, but it cost too much. So then they had lunch. When they had lunch, they thought about the sombrero. And finally, they decided to get it, after all. So they threw what was left to one of the stray dogs. Then when they were walking towards the stray dog, they looked behind them, and one of the stray dogs was following them. And Sam's mother said,
"Isn't he cute?"
and Sam's father said,
"Does anybody own this Mexican stray dog?"
and they just said no and shrugged their shoulders. Nope.
Nope.
So then they decided to get it, but they weren't allowed to take pets across the border. So they snuck it in a box and took it home. When they got home, Sam asked, "What is it?" And Sam's mother said,
"I think it's a Mexican hairless."
So then they brushed it and bathed it, and that night it slept on Sam's bed. Next morning, Sam yelled, "Ma, Pa, I think the dog has a cold." When they looked at it, the dog had runny eyes and had something wet around its mouth. So then the mother took it to the vet, and the doctor asked,
"Where did you get this?" "In Mexico. I think it's a Mexican hairless." "That's what I was just going to ask you, because this isn't a Mexican hairless. This isn't even from Mexico. This is a sewer rat that has rabies."
"Rabies?"
Once there was a little boy that stayed, and it was summertime, and he stayed home with his mother because his father had died a few years ago, and he got really bored because he had no friends, and they all had went to a summer camp or something. And his mom decided that she would bring him to a camp. So he went to a camp. And then his mother got really upset because her husband had died and her son had gone away to a camp. So then she decided that she would be a cook at the camp. And then the little boy, the day she came, the little boy went to the camp. The little boy was on a camping trip. And he was going to a mountain, and the mountain that they saw was a forbidden mountain to go on. And that night, he went on the mountain, and he climbed the mountain. Then he got knocked over by a birch tree branch, and he died. And then his mother got so upset when she heard that he died that she killed herself with a butcher knife. And then the next day, a few years later, a little boy, he climbed that same mountain, and he went to the top, but nothing happened to him. So when he climbed to the top, he saw this lady coming toward him with a butcher knife, and she was walking pretty slowly, but he got pretty scared too. He started shaking, but he picked up the closest thing toward him, which was a branch, and he held it up to her, but nothing happened. She kept running toward him faster and faster. And then the next day, a minute later, he picked up the next closest thing. He grabbed it, and he brought it up to her, and she kept running toward him faster and faster with the butcher knife in her hand. And then he picked up the next closest thing. That was a birch tree branch. He held it up, and then she started screaming, and she was never seen again.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
And my name is Jessie.
The name of our story is The Ghostly Hitchhiker. Once there were this couple. They had just gotten married, and they were on their way to their honeymoon, which was in Columbus, Ohio. And along the side of the road was a drop, a 15-feet drop, and inside was a swamp. And they kept on driving along. And then their headlights picked out a figure of a girl. And they stopped and made sure that it was okay to ask her in. So they asked her in. And she said, "Okay, thank you." And then they kept on driving. And then after a while, they asked,
"Where are you going?"
And she said, "I'm going to 522 Columbus, Ohio, to my brother's house to see my mom." And so they kept on driving around. And then after a while, they asked,
"Would you mind if we stopped for some coffee?"
And she wasn't there. They were terrified. But first they went and they got their coffee. And then they drove to the address. And then they knocked on the door. And after a couple of minutes, there were footsteps coming down. And some guy opened the door, and they said, we came here because the girl just gave us this address, and she told us that she was going to visit her mother and her brother at this house.
We needed to go on no more. I know the rest of the story. The girl you just met was my sister. She was killed in a car accident when her car went over the side of the road. You just experienced what 3 other people have experienced, and it happens every anniversary of her death.
Once there were this couple who had just gotten married. The wife said to the husband, "Would you like to go to the carnival?" And he said, "Okay." So they were driving along the road when they saw a carnival. They got out of the car and went through the gates. They went over to the roller coaster, but that was locked up. The carnival had looked deserted. Then they were walking around when the husband saw a love boat ride. He said to the wife, "Let's go on the love boat ride." So they did, because the love boat ride was open and the love boats are going around. When the owner came out, he said 2, and the husband said yes. And he said that they could take the next boat. So he took the next boat. After they were in the tunnel, a light flashed up ahead. Once they got there, it was a picture of two people hanging. The wife screamed, but the husband said, "It's okay, they're just wax figures." But the wife said, but they look so real." So then the light went off. They kept on going down a little bit more. Then another light shined up ahead. It was another person laying on the ground, dead, with blood coming out and a knife in his back. And the wife screamed again. But the husband said, "It's just wax figures, they're not real." And then the light went off. They went up a little bit more when they saw another light come on. It was a person killing another guy. The wife screamed. The husband said, "They are just wax figures, they're not real." So the light went off. They went up a little bit more. Then they bumped into something. The husband got out to see what it was. He pulled it out of the water. It was a person, a real person. None of those other figures were wax figures. They were real people. He pulled it out of the water. The person in the water was a real person. The owner of the Love Boat ride came out. He said, "For all these years I have been running this carnival. Everybody said that those are wax figures, but they're not. They're real people. And you're going to be my new exhibit." So he had shackles in his hand, and he started to chase them. He chased them through the water. Once he was out of sight, the wife was tired, so the husband found a spot for her to sit down. So then when they could see him again, they got back up. And then when he was out of sight again, she sat back down. He started to come close to them. They kept on running. They saw the exit door, but the owner said, "It's no use, it's locked." So they kept on running to the exit door. The husband kept on pushing on it. There was a board across it on the other side. They kept on pushing and pushing. Then finally the owner, he came up and he started chasing them. The husband started to fight with him. He pushed him in the water. Then the husband finally broke open the door. He ran around to the gates, but the owner had gotten up. He said, "The gates are locked too." So the husband fought with the owner of the Love Boat ride. The wife started climbing the fence. So the husband punched the guy out, and then the husband climbed over the gate, and he got into the car, and they drove away, and the owner was never to be seen again.